By now, you've heard plenty of commentary and analysis on the $1.776 billion slush fund created by Donald Trump's Justice Department as a system of rewarding his friends, allies, and January 6 rioters. But you may not have heard all of the terms of the 9-page agreement that's supposed to lay out the architecture for the whole thing, and which our next guest describes as a recipe for a star chamber, which creates a mechanism for the public never to learn about who is being funded with taxpayer money and have no mechanism for any accountability over the decisions made by 5 people whose rules and determinations may never be made public. Take a moment to subscribe right now to All Rise News and Legal AF, and we welcome onto the show a frequent guest of this program, my friend, former federal prosecutor Mitchell Epner. Mitch, great to see you again.
So great to see you, and you put your finger right on it. This document is recreating the Star Chamber. And for those who are not law school graduates or fanboys of, 15th and 16th century English monarchy stuff, the Star Chamber was a way for the king to have secret courts with no procedures where nobody would ever know what happened except by looking at the results and saying, oh, that person's land was seized. Something must have happened. That person was executed. Something must have happened. This is the antithesis of due process under law. This is Donald Trump creating a $1.776 billion slush fund to be doled out by his 5 handpicked privy counselors in order to reward the people who tried to execute the January 6th coup. It is a dark day.
Let's talk about how that Star Chamber operates. I'm going to read from the settlement agreement right now. Quote, the anti-weaponization fund shall consist of 5 members. Within 30 days of the effective date, the Attorney General shall issue an order appointing the members, including the chair of the anti-weaponization fund, with such order being treated as incorporated herein. One of the members will be chosen in consultation with congressional leadership, end quote. So Todd Blanche, Trump's former criminal defense attorney and attorney general acting capacity, is in charge of the entire composition of the entire thing, correct?
Yes, and all of the people on there serve at the will of the president. So Todd Blanche also serves at the pleasure of the president. So this is Donald Trump's opportunity to appoint anybody he wants to.
Right. And as a matter of fact, it says in the agreement that any of those members can be removed by the president, who can remove any member without cause and then would be replaced through the same way. And a quorum is 3 members. I want to kind of turn to the next part of this that echoes your Star Chamber framing. The Anti-Weaponization Fund may make their procedures public in whole or in part in its discretion. What does that mean in terms of how the public can understand even the metrics they use to decide how to dole out their tax money?
It is a roach motel. The money goes in, nothing comes out. We, the tax-paying members of the public, will pay $1.776 billion to Donald Trump's 5 handpicked people who will do with it whatever they want, and nobody will ever have any right to know that something happened, let alone what happened.
And it continues a little later, quote, on a quarterly basis or otherwise as directed by the Attorney General, the Anti-Weaponization Fund shall provide to the Attorney General a confidential report that indicates the name and address of each claimant who has received any relief, and if so, the nature of such relief. So the public does not receive the report that Blanche receives, correct?
The public doesn't receive it. Congress doesn't receive it. The courts do not receive it. And if the Attorney General says, you know what, I never need to receive it, that's within the Attorney General's discretion also.
There was one detail of the original ABC News story that caught my attention, that Trump and his family members couldn't personally be claimants, but corporate entities could. I want you to kind of interpret this next line from the settlement agreement. Quote, submission of a claim to the Anti-Weaponization Fund is voluntary. Claimants can also include entities. What does that mean?
It means that, in the words of our regrettable Chief Justice, corporations are people.
And also that
cronyism. Corporations, LLCs, foreign home offices, anybody can submit a claim. It is not limited to U.S. citizens. It's not limited to real people. It could be the Saudi sovereign wealth fund.
And that could enrich Trump's family members, obviously, that particular example. So if Trump had an entity that claimed that it was a victim of weaponization, it could get paid and the public would never have to learn about it?
If it submits a claim, that claim could be written in crayon, have zero merit to it, be rubber stamped by the 5 handpicked members, and nobody in the public would ever know about it.
And let's go to the kind of definitions here. They say, quote, to be eligible for relief, a claimant must assert at least one legal claim stating the claimant was a victim of lawfare and or weaponization. Exactly what statute in U.S. law and U.S. code is lawfare and weaponization written under? And as you read the settlement agreement, is there any definition to either of these terms?
Yes. So let's start with, this is made out of whole cloth. This is Rumpelstiltskin. But there is a purported definition in Section 1C, which says the conduct alleged in the case and in the pending agency claims is representative of the sustained use of the levers of government power by Democrat-elected officials, political and career federal employees, contractors, and agents in order to target individuals, groups, and entities for improper and unlawful political, personal, and/or ideological reasons. And that is defined as lawfare and weaponization. Now, that definition includes anything that the 5 members of the panel wanted to, which means anything Donald Trump wants it to.
And as you read from that passage, it alludes to democratic. There was some sort of noise made in the Trump Justice Department press release about how this is not a partisan fund at all. But the one example that they give does have a partisan affiliation, right?
It's worse than that. If a lawyer who wasn't Todd Blanche, who has sold his soul to Donald Trump, but if a actual intelligent lawyer who was doing an honest read of this was trying to make an argument, they could contend that only that lawfare and weaponization requires that the bad deeds happened under Democratic control and bad deeds that happened under Republican control do not qualify.
And want to read this particular passage. The settlement agreement is enforceable and challengeable solely by plaintiffs, defendants, and the United States. We saw, even before this was announced, the Trump DOJ trying to sideline the judiciary over this. Are they trying to insulate this from any sort of outside instrument of accountability?
Yes. And that's why I said this is the Star Chamber. According to the document itself, it can't be challenged by any member of Congress. It can't be challenged by Congress in total. It can't be brought before any court. There is no review over Donald Trump's dictatorial powers. And what I mean by dictatorial is literally, he dictates it, he says it, it happens.
And there's this one clause that I want you to unpack why this is important to Donald Trump. It says the corpus of the Anti-Weaponization Fund's funding does not represent the current value of any current claim by the plaintiffs, but rather is based on the projected valuation of future claimants' claims. And accordingly, the corpus of the Anti-Weaponization Fund's funding is not taxable income to plaintiffs who receive no economic benefit from this settlement agreement. What does that mean, and why is Trump and his family and his company worried about this settlement being taxable income?
Okay, so I'm going to thank you for asking that question. That is a really important set of issues. I'm going to start with the tax part of it. It is doctrine of United States tax law going back more than a century that income has the broadest possible definition. It means any funds received from any source, even if they are redirected to a third party. There are some very small caveats to that, but basically, this is trying to flout over a century of tax law because Donald Trump has redirected $1.776 billion from the U.S. Treasury that is going to his preferred people. For anybody else on the planet, that would be considered income. As income, it would be taxed at the top rate, and he would owe roughly 33% of that. So call it $600 million in taxes.
And so what's the consequences of that? If it is eventually found, this is probably bound to be challenged at some point, and that clause is considered against all precedent. What happens to the people who are associated with the Treasury, the IRS, who enable the use of this money in this way without tax ramifications for Donald Trump?
So there are a couple of questions that are packed into that. Let me start with the tax part of it because that's the most concrete. At some point, somebody who is not Donald Trump and is not a toady of Donald Trump will be president of the United States. If that happens within 6 years, the IRS will go after Donald Trump for tax payments on this money. That would lead to a court eventually, hopefully, saying, yes, Donald Trump, you owe $600 million plus penalties and interest since then. Given the current composition of the Supreme Court, I have limited faith that that would occur. The second question that you asked, and it's also a great question, is what about the people who enable this theft of money from the U.S. Treasury? Because beyond the tax issues, it is the idea that Trump, as a settlement for his case, can, without any procedures whatsoever, without any cases ever being filed, off the top of his head say, I think there'll be cases filed in the future. I think they'll be worth $1.776 billion. So I'm going to take money that I, Donald Trump, could have received and put it into this fund. And let people make claims against that in the future. Funding that is almost, I don't want to say almost certainly, I think is in high probability a federal crime of the highest order that would lead the people doing it to being eventually prosecuted for felonies, except in the world of Trump versus the United States, Donald Trump can't be prosecuted for his official acts. And, the perfidy of the Supreme Court in Trump versus United States rips at the fabric of the rule of law every single day. This is the latest example. We have John Roberts, who is doing his best Roger Taney imitation. They are destroying the rule of law because they believe that they would rather have the problems that came from enabling Donald Trump and making him satiated than the problems that came from trying to control Donald Trump. They are destroying our constitutional republic.
The New York Times reported right after the announcement of this fund, the general counsel for the U.S. Treasury left his position. Do you think that's a coincidence?
It's not a coincidence. It is an act of somebody who was willing to go the first 19 steps along our descent into fascism, but not the 20th.
And let's talk about the challenges that might come to this settlement agreement, I should say, purported settlement agreement in the future. This is supposed to be settling Trump's own lawsuit against his IRS. He sued the IRS earlier this year for $10 billion over the leak of his tax records in 2019, when his tax records, along with more than 400,000 other people's, were disclosed by an IRS contractor who wanted the public to get a peek under the hood of how the wealthy paid or did not pay their taxes. That contractor, Charles Littlejohn, was prosecuted, and this 2019 leak happened during Trump's first term. How will the challenge, do you think, to this settlement agreement and the fund itself take place?
I have no idea, because that's the biggest problem. It is not clear to me, and I don't think it's clear to anybody, who has standing to go after this star chamber. It is a basic rule of U.S. jurisprudence that merely being a taxpayer does not give an individual standing to challenge raids on the Treasury. And in order to be able to have standing, you have to be able to show particularized harm. I don't know who has particularized harm, and even if somebody could come up with a good theory, I don't trust the 6 Chinese on the Supreme Court to go along with it, because they would rather acquiesce to Donald Trump.
But let's say there is a litigant somewhere who is found by a court to have standing, and maybe it's a fool's errand, and that the Supreme Court will never agree that anyone has standing to challenge it. But if that were to happen, what would be the basis for challenging the terms of a settlement between Trump and the IRS over these claims involving the leak of his tax records in 2019?
Well, it's a sham. I mean, if you get past the standing problem, the actual law here is very easy. This is a sham. The claim that Trump could have brought is barred by the statute of limitations. The claim that he could have brought does not lead to anything like the sort of damages that we're talking about. The claim that he could have brought is something that no reasonable individual could conclude was really being settled here. This is Donald Trump standing on both sides of the V and saying, I'm going to take $1.77 billion out of the Treasury that I have been, as president, appointed to oversee, and put it into my own pocket. And then I'm going to hand it out from my own pocket to the people who tried to stage a coup to keep me in power.
And one thing that I had read earlier, but I want to focus on a particular phrase. Trump's Justice Department is claiming that the $1.776 billion number is, quote, the projected valuation of future claimants' claims. Do you think that's why they chose that number?
No, I don't think that's why they chose that number.
It was a layup question. Why, but can you unpack that? Why 1776? Because to me, it sounds like a dog whistle for the rioters who stand to be enriched by this award.
So let me start with the silliness, and then I'll get to the serious part. This is the equivalent of, I forget what movie it's from, but somebody saying, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 12. What is it? And the person guesses 4. And they say, no, it was 9. And it's absolutely, there is no process here. There is no way for somebody to have a reasonable estimate of who would be filing claims in the future, the merits of those claims, and what they are worth. 1.776 billion is literally a number that was picked out of thin air. Now, why was it picked out of thin air? It was picked out of thin air to mirror the year 1776. There's a good reason and there's an evil reason why. The good reason is 1776 is when the United States declared independence from Great Britain, and we're coming on the 250th anniversary. And this was supposed to be like the bicentennial year, except nobody is celebrating. I'm old enough to have been around for the bicentennial celebration. It was joyous. It was, frankly, the end of the Watergate, post-Vietnam malaise. People were having a good time. 250 is nothing like that. The evil reason is that 1776 was grabbed upon by the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers and the other insurrectionists as their rallying cry, as they prepared to and then did invade Congress in an attempt to, by a coup, prevent Joe Biden from lawfully taking office.
And they are the ones who stand to be enriched by the $1.776 billion fund. Isn't that right?
You remember the guy with the water buffalo hat with the spear who was walking around with Nancy Pelosi's podium wearing a bare chest and like some fur vest? I would expect that guy's going to get a couple $100 million. That's your tax dollars at work. Anybody who works hard for their money and looks at the amount that's being withdrawn for federal taxes, it's going to the guy in the water buffalo hat who was walking around with Nancy Pelosi's podium and lectern and, putting his feet up on the desk. It's going to, Ernest Rhodes or whatever is Stuart Rhodes, and, his eye patch. Maybe he'll get a diamond encrusted eye patch now because he's getting a couple of $100 million also.
And if it did, under the terms of this 9-page agreement, none of us in the general public will ever know about it unless they choose to disclose it.
And that brings us back to the Star Chamber part of it. People then would be looking at Stuart Rhodes and saying, hey, he's got a diamond encrusted eye patch. He must have gotten a lot of money from the Trump weaponization fund.
Thank you so much, Mitchell Epner, for joining us. And folks who want to find out more about this and other subjects and who want to read the 9-page settlement agreement for themselves and to see the kind of analysis and the black and white terms that we've unpacked throughout this program, visit www.allrisenews.com and All Rise News on Substack. And take a moment right now to subscribe to Legal AF.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.